Most people overpay for car insurance, not because they're careless, but because switching feels like too much hassle. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/Libsyn today. That's JERRY.ai/LIBSYN.
This is episode 3 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Philippa Brawl, writer and lead historian at British History Tours. Another great method for studying history of Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
To a sense that linking the Bible with Shakespeare's name in the 21st century is as much about elevating the Bible as it is Shakespeare.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Hello, I am Cassidy Cash. We have Jem Bloomfield here with us today. Jem is an author, blogger, and assistant professor of literature at the University of Nottingham. His research ranges across Shakespeare, gender, performance, and the Bible, with a particular focus on the way texts are used to focus cultural authority. Dr. Bloomfield's work has been cited in The Guardian, The New Statesman, and Contemporary Theatre Review. His latest book is titled Shakespeare and the Psalms. Did Shakespeare help write the King James Bible? He's here today to talk with us about that very legend and set the record straight on this persistent question. Hello, Jem. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, Cassidy. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Absolutely. Jem is an author with his new book, obviously, but as a professor who specializes in a pretty unique field of Shakespeare and biblical studies, Jem, I wonder if you could give us a brief backstory on how you ended up studying Shakespeare as a focus.
Certainly. Like a lot of people, I think, who study English literature at university, I was introduced to an awful lot of stuff in my undergraduate degree that I'd never heard of before, let alone even read before. So everything from Beowulf to George Gissing and revenge tragedies of the Renaissance and sort of pastoral allegories of the early modern literary scene. And I loved a lot of them. I was very, very tempted to become a specialist in Anglo-Saxon literature at one point. Wonderful, wonderful poems. But I worked my way back to one of my early loves, which was Shakespearean drama. I'm very keen on all early modern drama, actually. I also really like the work of people like John Webster and Chapman and Dekker and people like that. Although, as my PhD supervisor told me, there's no such thing as a lecturer in John Webster. He said, what you are is a lecturer in Shakespeare, and you better get used to it. And as we'll perhaps discuss a bit later on, the figure of Shakespeare has come to loom so very large in British and American literary culture that not only the works, but their reception absolutely fascinated me. I came to be very interested in what people had done with Shakespeare, what they used Shakespeare for, as well as what Shakespeare's works were. And that's how I eventually, I think, ended up as a sort of focusing on Shakespeare and the Bible.
In his book, Jem mentions that he wrote this latest book after receiving an email from Shakespeare's Globe asking about Shakespeare and the King James Bible. That being such a unique start to an entire book, please tell us, Jem, just briefly, the backstory of how you went from sending a reply to a colleague all the way to let's write a book.
Yes. It was, as you say, a bit of a leap. So I got an email from Will Tosh, who's a lecturer and research fellow over at Shakespeare's Globe, and he'd been asked this question by someone: did Shakespeare help write the King James Bible? And Will was convinced it wasn't true. You know, it's not something that he was worried about, not something that puzzled him. He was so certain that it wasn't true that he had no idea where the theory could have come from. So he sent me an email saying, have you heard this story before? You know, and why on earth would someone ask this? Is this some sort of crypto theory I haven't heard about, or is there some manuscript that I haven't read that this has come out of? And so, I said, I have heard this story before, and yes, it is nonsense. It is absolutely as strange and unbelievable as it sounds. But I am familiar with the idea. I asked him for a sort of an afternoon's grace, and I said, if I have a bit more time, I will jot down why I don't think it's the case. So I looked at the historical angle, the context of theatre and biblical translation at the time, the poetic angle, why this doesn't look like a Shakespeare poem, why there are other poems at the time that look much more like psalmic poetry rather than just a translation to Psalms. And I looked at the textual side of things, the fact that the theory is based upon a particular textual coincidence, the fact that shake is the 46th word from the beginning of the psalm, and spear is the 46th word, supposedly, and we'll get into that later, from the end of the psalm. So I put together about 3,000 words to back up more than my sort of reckon of, no, I don't reckon so. And in doing so, I thought, well, that's actually a fascinating question. How do you address a question that isn't a historical theory? How do you bring history to bear on something that is essentially a myth, a coincidence, an urban legend? And so I became very interested both in how you brought conventional scholarship to bear on something that was basically a conspiracy theory, and then later on why people told that story. There are various rumours about Shakespeare that we don't believe are true. So the idea that Queen Elizabeth asked him to write The Merry Wives of Windsor because she wanted to see a play in which Falstaff fell in love, or the idea that William Davenant was Shakespeare's illegitimate son. And these stories often go back quite far into history. The one about William Davenant actually starts with Davenant himself. He appears to have made up this story, if that makes sense, to try and claim sort of some of Shakespeare's sort of cachet. The one about Queen Elizabeth, I think, can be traced back to the early 18th century, late 17th century. The idea that Shakespeare helped write the King James Bible, that he signed his name in the 46th Psalm, is really quite a late story. There doesn't seem to be any trace of it before the late 19th century. So I got really interested in where this story came from. And as I said previously, like, what are people using Shakespeare for here? What is Shakespeare supposed to stand for in this story? And so in about a week, I had got to the point where I wanted to write something more substantial about this. And it took me about, a month after that to think, it could be doable if I could steal time from my teaching and my research elsewhere.
Yeah, it definitely outgrew an email for sure.
Yes, exactly that. Yes, it was something that could not be answered simply or quickly sufficiently, I think. And so it germinated into a book.
As someone who's done heavy research on, I guess I'm going to call it a controversial topic, even though you and your colleague sort of started out with the position of this is nonsense and we're going to prove it. Mm-hmm. What was that like when you're going in there? I mean, obviously, the obvious criticism is that you went in with a bias. So yes, can you talk to us a little bit about your strategies for avoiding personal bias when you were gathering evidence for this topic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you say, that the book is open to the very fair charge that it was written based upon my conviction that this was not only not the case, it could never have been the case, it was not reasonable to think it was the case, and so why am I bothering to write a book about it? It was definitely one that it wasn't something that I investigated, shall we say, completely objectively. I thought I knew it wasn't the case. So yeah, there is a charge of personal bias that's quite reasonable. And I think that charge often comes when we engage with what we might call the less orthodox side of theories about Shakespeare. The elephant in the room, of course, is the authorship question. The idea that in fact, Shakespeare did write Shakespeare, that other people wrote his plays for him. And people are often scholars are often accused when they deny this theory that they have some sort of inbuilt personal bias, as you've suggested. Like any literary historical investigation, I suppose the best way to avoid personal bias, in my experience, is to try and make the case against yourself the whole time. So that can be on an evidentiary basis when you're investigating a source and you've probably been brought to that source by something particular in it that you think proves your point or that interests you for some reason. So, you read a source and, it's a 16th century letter about preparations for a celebration at New Year, but they happen to mention the name of someone who you thought was in a different city at the time, and you're like, aha, this is significant. I care about this. And one of the ways one of the ways I think to try and guard against overstretching your evidence is to ask yourself, why was this letter written? Why does this source exist? It wasn't created for me 400 years later to go, aha! It was created for a purpose in the 16th century. So you ask yourself, why was it produced? What would someone think was the point of this source if it wasn't being used in my book? That's one way of looking at it. What is the integrity of the document itself? What does this source purport to talk about? And be aware that as a scholar, you're always, or almost always, at a bit of an angle. You're always trying to fit something into your view of things or your argument. Another way to do that is to actually make the case against yourself whilst writing. And I've done this. When you've made your argument, you then set yourself the task of writing a counter-argument and saying, this source could equally well mean this, or the argument I have just made is vulnerable to saying it goes too far, to saying that the evidence supports another theory. And actually, you can end up making a pretty good case against yourself, even if you start by thinking, there's no reasonable human being who could ever think that I am wrong here. Simply in the process of forcing yourself to think, but what? What if some terrible fool were to find this source? And actually forcing yourself to build, if you like, the case for the prosecution or the case for defense.
Absolutely.
It often strengthens your work, I think. Whether or not that actually ends up in the final draft of the research, it's a really useful process to put yourself through.
Which definitely comes through in your book. I think when I read it, you can see that you do try to do both sides of each argument that you present. But I wanted to unpack just a little bit, a few of them that you go through in the book, starting with Jem defines theater attendance in his book as an activity which produces what he calls cultural capital by, quote, giving people who regularly attend an air of social importance and good judgment. So I want to ask you, Jem, do you think part of the reason this legend about Shakespeare writing the Bible exists in the first place was to try and lend Shakespeare, or even perhaps the Bible's modern reputation, an air of that social importance?
Yes, I think it may go in both directions, in fact. Yes, this idea of cultural capital that comes out of the work of Pierre Bourdieu, the French social theorist of the early 20th century, has become immensely important, I think, in understanding what Shakespeare is and does in the 20th and 21st centuries. Bourdieu became very concerned with the way in which apparently aesthetic judgments about what kind of music you liked, or what kind of paintings you hung on your wall, or even what kind of clubs or societies your children joined at school, were as much statements about who you were in social class terms and who you weren't, more crucially, than they were abstract statements about, I happen to like that chord, or I happen to think that's a lovely watercolor. And the book I quoted in my book was a work on social class by Mike Savage and his team, who undertook this fascinating investigation of the structure of social class in Britain in about 2013. And cultural capital was one of the major areas that they addressed. In fact, it seemed to be so important that one of the websites that sells theatre tickets in London reported there was an enormous and inexplicable spike in the sale of theatre tickets in London during the time that they were doing surveys on class in Britain. They used the British Broadcasting Corporation to send their survey out. Even asking people about what class they thought they were suddenly sold loads of theatre tickets in London. It was an extraordinary and sort of unintended effect of their work.
Yeah, really.
Yes, it's bizarre. So yes, the idea that theatre is somehow good for individuals, it's morally edifying, it is a mark of being a sort of a socially refined person, is both very significant about theatre now and totally not the case in the 16th century, 400 years ago, as you know. Theatre at the time is seen as debauched, as conducing to the laziness of apprentices and workers, contributing to the breakdown of socially approved gender roles. It causes riots, drunkenness. It's generally a bad thing. So there's this huge dislocation between what theatre seems to have meant at the time, Shakespeare's time, and what it means now, which, as you suggest, contributes, I think, and this is only speculation, but it's speculation that fits the facts, to a sense that linking the Bible with Shakespeare's name in the 21st century is as much about elevating the Bible as it is Shakespeare. After all, since the 19th century, so we say, the Bible has not had the same kind of central role in both British and American culture as it perhaps did back then. Certainly British Victorian culture was explicitly Reformed, explicitly evangelical and Protestant in its general tone, and you'll find a lot of writing by biblical scholars and perhaps more popular evangelists in the 20th and 21st centuries that's very keen on this idea that the Bible is a wonderful literary work. If only we gave it the chance, it has all these wonderful stories or beautiful poetry. Why do people run after other forms of culture when they had everything in the Bible that they needed? And so, yes, by what would seem, I think, an extraordinary paradox and a ridiculous sort of canard to people in the 17th century, we end up in a situation in the 21st where suggesting that Shakespeare, a writer for the common playhouses, was involved with the translation of the Bible is a way of elevating the Bible, not elevating Shakespeare.
True. And obviously, you've made a great point there with culture evolving over time and it not being the same context when Shakespeare was writing it as it is now. But I think we can say that the playhouse and Shakespeare's work were used for political means. So I wonder if you could address the argument that precisely because James I in particular was trying to function as a religious peacemaker in England, there's an argument that it would have made sense to hire Shakespeare specifically because he enjoyed something of a status of celebrity under James's patronage. And there are some that argue that when looking for writers of the Bible, Shakespeare would have been at best a natural choice or at worst compelled to participate by the power of his patron. In your research, what were you able to find out about how James I chose the people who did write the Bible and the potential that Shakespeare would have been involved?
Yes. You're right. Early modern theatre is an explicitly political medium. That's terribly important. It stages kings. It presents stories of battles, of the ends of monarchies, of the beginning of other dynasties. This is a form that is about power, who has power, who wields power. And it's also a form, of course, about history, how we legitimate present forms of power. In fact, there are theorists of the early modern theatre who would argue that it has a demystifying effect, that putting a king or an aristocrat up on the stage and having an actor play them might cause people in real life to look at a king or an aristocrat and think, that person's just playing at being a king. You know, the process of kingship and monarchy is itself a set of theatrical acts. This was very, very popular with new historicists in the late 20th century. And there's a famous anecdote, which was very popular amongst those scholars, that Richard II, which was the case, was staged the night before the Earl of Essex rebellion. And that was funded by the conspirators, that they wanted to put on a play in which power was transferred from someone who appeared to be the legitimate monarch but was not good enough to be a monarch to someone else who had more of a sort of brutal might is right approach. Elizabeth herself is supposed to have identified herself with a fictional king in rather the same way. So I absolutely agree. Early modern theatre is a political form. It's about power. Where I think my interpretation of history would diverge here is the idea that James would be interested or concerned with forwarding his religious sort of peacemaking project by producing a popular book. It's much more likely that, in my opinion, that he would be interested in court masques, in diplomacy, in organizing dynastic marriages. He attempts to marry his son Charles to the Infanta Maria of Spain, which sadly for him, doesn't work. Although that's another great story. I'm not convinced that trying to improve the literary quality of the Bible would be a way in which James was hoping to take forward his political and religious project, shall we say. We also, as you mentioned, have quite good records of who was involved in the translation of the King James Bible. And it was almost exclusively, I think with one exception, clergymen and scholars. These were people who were in holy orders. An awful lot of them were attached to colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. They were people who had long careers in the established church, who were recognized scholars. There's One of the instructions that's given to the translators instructs bishops to let their clergy know that this project is happening and to ask people who are particularly skilled in Hebrew and Greek to contribute their thoughts to the bishop, and the bishop, if they're good enough thoughts, might forward them on. So even the instructions that we've got, they don't actually say you should only use clergymen and scholars, but they assume all the way along that it's so obvious that it will only be clergymen involved, they never actually have to say that.
Which goes back to your point about Shakespeare not having the right reputation for this role.
Exactly that.
So expound, if you would, on the role of legends in society. And you talk about cultural authority. So these legends, how are they impacting our understanding of the past? Do you think that because something is held in local legend or even popular lore that it's automatically discredited in its historicity? Should we be skeptical of these things?
Legends are incredibly important. I think they're an absolutely vital part of human culture. I think they're often central to how we as nations, how we as groups and regions, how even we as families construct our past. They are ways of telling us who we are. And I don't discount legends by any means. I think they're terribly important. I think we have to be somewhat careful about taking them as traces of the historical past. Or as always, traces of the historical past and as accurate, because they so often serve a purpose in the present. There's an example, I think it comes in Walter Ong's work on oral culture and literate culture, where he tells the story of some people who record a traditional story that starts, Underwood Japka the king had 5 sons, and one day near the end of his life, he called his sons to him. Okay, this story goes on to tell the story about the king and his sons. The same story is recorded about 100 years later, and the story starts, Underwood Japka the king had 4 sons, and near the end of his life, he called his sons to him. And the difference between those two stories is obviously the number of the sons, and between that time, there were now 4 regional subdivisions of that kingdom rather than 5. So quite obviously, the story has changed to explain why there are 4 rather than 5, or indeed that the people telling that story probably don't know there's a previous version in which he has 5 sons. The legend is much more about explaining the current state of the kingdom to the people who live there. And this can be done in more subtle ways. I mean, I live and work in Nottingham, so I'm very fond of the Robin Hood legends. Terribly interesting and terribly good fun. And they do different cultural work at different times. So perhaps in the 16th century, they're more about expressing uncertainty about the legitimacy of kingship. They obviously feature a bad king, a king who, though technically on the throne, is really a stand-in for a good, splendid, warlike king, Richard Coeur de Lion, who is out in the Crusades at the time. Then in the 19th century, I suspect, again, I'm not a scholar of folklore, but it feels to me like telling these stories is about the idea that we could escape to the greenwood and we could live this life beyond industrialism, and we could live, in tune with the past, and we could live amongst trees rather than amongst brick stacks and this kind of thing. And then if you look at the late 20th century, you get Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where suddenly Robin Hood is about understanding cross cultures, about having a Muslim friend who's black, about respecting women and not preying on the poor, and having this sort of equal and just society that rests on toleration and understanding of diversity. These are all powerful visions of the world, and I think they're compelling and they're essential. What they are not, of course, is records of the life of Robert of Locksley. As far as we know, there might be, who knows? There's enough stories been told about him. Some of them must be true at some point. I think legends are so important that I think that they have their own logic, they have their own power, and so I think they're so significant that we need to keep them apart from historiography as far as possible and understand them for what they are.
Well, speaking of legends, let's take a look at one from your book. Jem admits in his book that if you ignore the selahs, it's true that if you count 46 words from the end and 46 words from the top in Psalm 46, that you do encounter the words shake and spear. And I've heard about this one since high school, so this one was fun to see you address. But while finding this evidence ultimately inadequate for the Shakespearean biblical authorship argument, Jem does conclude that textual criticism is a valuable method of exploring history. So, Jem, please address how you think textual criticism can both be a valuable method of exploring history as well as wholly ineffective for this argument for Shakespeare and the King James Bible.
Yes. Now, here, I'm afraid, Cassidy, you and I diverge because I think this is an extremely effective form of analysis, only because it proves my point. In the sciences, after all, a null result is as much a proof as a positive result. So getting in there and using close textual analysis, textual reading of this psalm, I think, is valuable because it proves that something is not the case. It's not possible. It's rather boring. Very few people have ever produced compelling papers that say, I have found something that is not true about the 14th century. Enormous applause all around. But yeah, close textual analysis of both the Bible and Shakespeare is absolutely fascinating and very valuable. One particular example that struck me actually came in Susan Gillingham's book on the poetry and psalms of the Hebrew Bible. I think that's the title, where she points out, as has been known for years, that several of the psalms begin with they're acrostics. They begin each line with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and they run through the entire sequence of the alphabet during that psalm. And this is, I think, more than just an organizing principle. It's more than just basically playing chess in the margins of the psalm book. It expresses some belief about the world that the psalms are describing. It suggests that, from one point of view, the worship given to God encompasses the whole world. If the alphabet contains the potential of every word that could be spoken, it contains the potential of every meaning that could exist within language. Encoding that alphabet into the beginning of the psalm suggests something about the completeness, about the complexity and intricacy, and also sort of a single unified meaning of the temple worship of Israel. And there's one particular psalm, I think it's 145, but I'd have to look it up, in which that sequence exists, but is also disrupted. So rather than running the equivalent of, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I won't get the letters right, but rather than running KLM, it runs MLK. The lines begin with what is apparently the wrong letter, except, if you believe Gillingham, this is not a mistake. This is deliberate, because if you put vowel pointings into those consonants, you get the word melech, which is the word for king in Hebrew. And the subject of this psalm is the dominion and kingship of God. So there is this, close textual analysis reveals this potentially extraordinary little, both technical device and also spiritual insight hidden in the center of this psalm. That it's a device almost within a device. So yes, I was very struck when I discovered that.
So you've mentioned the importance of worldview, and both of yourself and of the time period that you're studying when you include textual criticism as part of your investigation of different myths or legends. And in the summary for his book, on his blog, Jem says, this legend encapsulates a lot of what people want to believe about history. I would like to ask you, Jem, to share with us your thoughts on the role of collective perception and the idea that, there's the saying, to the winner goes the history books. And what do you think this idea brings to what we think we know about past events?
I think it's an absolutely essential filter. One that both keeps us honest, as we discussed previously about how you avoid personal bias. It's necessary to think, why might I think this, other than the obvious fact that I think the evidence points to it? What has brought me to this point? What has guided my investigations, my research, aside from the total objective, looking at the facts? It also works, of course, as you've suggested, on a much more grand scale, a much more structural scale. The reason why there are probably, 20,000 PhD theses about Milton and 12 about Jean Rhys is not simply that Jean Rhys has not been dead as long as Milton has been. There are, the way in which we organize scholarship, history, the humanities generally, is guided by, and in some cases constrained by, obviously, enormous factors, enormous vested interests, and accepted worldviews that certain things are important, other things are not important. I spoke previously about the idea that legends are partly ways in which we explain ourselves, that we say, who we are, what we value, why we do what we do. And of course, that raises, rather begs, an enormous question: who we are. Who is this us that is in the forefront of the humanities? And so many of the enormous strides that have been made over the last 100 years in the humanities have, I think, been focused around the expansion and interrogation of that we. When we say this is the writing that we have inherited, who is this we? Who are these us's? And so I think it is both as true on an individual level that we tell particular stories because they reflect vested interests that won the war, or that came out triumphant in the class struggle, depending on your view of history. But yes, the very fact that certain books are on university courses, and that, for example, we are talking about a certain author now across the Atlantic, is guided enormously by the victors, whether, as you say, those struggles are economic, social, political, or intellectual.
Exploring that collective they who always seem to say things like they think we should do this, or they
yes.
should that. I think it's absolutely valuable. So all total, though, taking the book as a whole and your entire research, for the record, and as a conclusion to this question, were there any moments in your research where you found a piece of evidence that caused you to think, even for a moment, wow, maybe Shakespeare was involved?
That's a very good question. There were perhaps two moments. Okay, two moments. One was, in fact, the bit about the Melech Psalm that I've already mentioned. I was reading that in Gillingham's work, and there was a moment when I thought, it's not proof of Shakespeare being there, but it's proof of the kind of puzzle, the kind of cipher. It's a code encoded in the psalm that I had been convinced would not have been sort of thought of when thinking about the Psalms. It didn't strike me as something that would have occurred to the translators of the Bible. And so when that came up, I thought, maybe this is the kind of code. It's something that involves adjusting very small things to spell out a secret message. Maybe this is something that the translators at the time would have known about. Of course, didn't tie it to Shakespeare, and of course didn't turn out to be true. But there was a moment when I thought, The other moment was when I went to see a colleague of mine, a much finer scholar than I am, and he said, "What are you working on?" I said, I'm drafting this thing. It might turn into a book. I'm working on this canard that Shakespeare was involved in the King James Bible translation. And my colleague said, "Oh, really? Oh, I see. Because of his involvement with court. Yes, I see. Is that possible?" And because my friend is a far finer scholar than I was, I went, "Oh, I didn't think so."
Better ask that question.
Yes, exactly. The fact that he took it perfectly seriously and open-mindedly made me think, oh, right. And then I returned to the research, and of course it turned out not to be true.
Well, wonderful. Well, I think we're very glad that you did ask this question, and I have appreciated you sharing your thoughts with us today. I do have a few questions not directly related to Shakespeare, but before I jump into those, is there anything else from your work or latest projects that you want to make sure we know?
Oh, that's very kind of you. I run a blog called Quite Irregular, which people might be interested to read. And that's across more areas than Shakespeare in the Bible. It talks about sort of gender in modern society and literature and theatre. So people might be interested in reading that. If they want to Google it, it's called Quite Irregular. But yes, that's about it.
Good. Well, think about the books you've read the last couple of years. What would you say are the 2 or 3 titles that immediately come to mind as having had the biggest impact on you?
Gosh.
You're only an academic. You don't read that many books, right?
Yes, I was struggling to think of a book that I have read. Okay, Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy. Extraordinary book. Totally rearranged the way I thought about not only fantasy literature, which is what it's about, but about what a really great critic can achieve in explaining the mechanism of the fantastical within literature. It's a wonderful book. She talks about the way in which the rhetoric and the arrangement of the story and how the reader receives information, how the characters relate to their world, etc., have a certain worldview or have a certain effect upon the shape of the story. So she, for example, distinguishes between portal fantasy, where characters appear in another universe, so something like Narnia. They go through often a door, and they have to explore this world that they don't know about. Or immersion, where the characters are already in a fantasy world that they supposedly know about. And she talks about the way in which that encourages a different relationship between the world, the information, the fantastical, the realistic, and what the fiction does. I'm giving a really bad account of what is a wonderful book, so that's definitely worth a look. I'm also very fond of Ronald Hutton. He's a very fine historian and literary scholar, and a lot of what I write seems to end up barking its shins on something that Ronald Hutton has already done before. So most recently, I read about 6 months ago his book, Witches, Druids and King Arthur, which is a selection of academic essays and journal articles that he's written over the last few years about those areas of his scholarly interest. It has a wonderful survey of the history of Glastonbury in culture, what Glastonbury has meant to different centuries, and why people attribute sort of certain paranormal or spiritual associations with it. It also has an essay in that I think is the best titled of any historical essay I've ever read. It's called A Modest Look at Ritual Nudity, and it surveys this subject across different forms of magic and witchcraft. I thought that was a lovely title, Modest Look.
Yes, intentional.
Yeah, I'm sure, yes.
Well, I believe that the study of Shakespeare's personal history is essential to the study of Shakespeare's plays. And you shared a little bit of this earlier, but what are some of your tips for investigating questions like this about Shakespeare and not getting carried away by the hype and diving into some of the things that you mentioned, like Shakespeare's supposed son or one like this about the Bible?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree that looking at the history of Shakespeare and indeed his personal history is enormously valuable. I suppose what I would stress overall is that we have a very distorted view of Shakespeare, as we've talked about, because we're looking at him sort of down the wrong end of a telescope. We are looking at 400 years of adaptation and citation and people writing, for example, books about him. What an idea. And staging his plays and holding him up as this sort of icon of English-speaking culture. So one of the ways I think is very useful to learn about him and research him without, as you say, getting carried away by the hype and the distortion is to look at the other people around him. So if one is reading Shakespeare's plays, to read some Dekker or some Marlowe or some Johnson to help even out the perception, so to speak. So if you think, oh gosh, this is this wonderful thing in this Shakespeare play, it might be something that every playwright at the time did, or if you think, oh, that's, that is frankly an irrelevant point. That seems to me, very, very minor. That might be something that's totally unique in Shakespeare's work. So looking at the literary culture and the historical culture of his time, I think is really useful. There's a very cutting line, I think Gary Taylor, I think it's in his work, where he complains about people who adhere to the authorship conspiracy and who think that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. And he says, all these people are convinced that it was the Earl of Essex or Queen Elizabeth or Sir Francis Bacon, and they won't believe it's a glovemaker's son from Stratford-upon-Avon. He says, the day upon which they suggest to me it was a miller's son from Ashby de la Zouche, I will listen to these people.
Well, and there you go. Well, what is next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about? More books on Shakespeare or something else?
Tangentially on Shakespeare, yes. I'm working at the moment, because I'm currently on research leave. I've had a semester of pottering around libraries and writing, which have been absolutely blissful. So I've got a draft of a current book I'm working on. Another almost accidental book. It is a study of the later period of Agatha Christie's writings. Specifically, it started off, in fact, as an investigation of how she uses Shakespeare and the Bible in her work. So there are these two big central chapters that are about Christie's Bible and Christie's Shakespeare. And she is an absolutely fascinating writer from that point of view. There are bits where she embeds quotations or echoes or citations that either sort of signal the murderer or send you on a wild goose chase. And in fact, it turns out, that this was a clue that you shouldn't have picked up on. And there are characters in her work that cite Shakespeare or the Bible, thinking that they're one character in the story, and actually it turns out they're another. There's a character in Hercule Poirot's Christmas who is convinced that he is the prodigal son returning. And it actually turns out that, well, I won't spoil it. I wouldn't be unfair to your listeners. It turns out that there are several prodigal sons returning to the house that night. And in fact, he's not the one who gets the fatted calf and the riches. So I say that there are essential chapters, and I'm also very interested in her the influence that Dorothy L. Sayers had on her and her sort of engagement with visual culture and the arts of the time. But yeah, it's another Shakespeare in the Bible book, but from a slightly different point of view.
Well, it sounds very interesting, and I know wherever your writing takes you next, Dr. Jem Bloomfield, we will be paying attention. Thank you so much for being here.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.